Great. So I have some questions that we could talk about, but I'm also I'd love for you guys to chat, and we also there was some stuff left at the end of last time, so we have preferences of which.
Okay. Well, I'd suggest that you tell us the things that would interest you, and I'll tell you a couple of areas that I'd like to go into at some point, and then Richard, if you have some that you do. Um, I mean, there are two rather massive areas of interest for me. I mean, one clearly is this business of lateralization in life, and how much you, for example, share my belief that this is important functionally and changes effectively the experience of the creature, the organism. And the other is the difference between living organisms and machines, particularly in the sense that they're being complex systems that are intrinsically unpredictable, and that whereas with a machine you can start from the ground up with the syntax of the machine and work out its meaning at some higher level of what it's doing, you can't really do this with an organism. You have to sort of work from both ends, if you like, top down, and seeing what it is achieving and what it is seeming to drive at, and from the bottom. But you can't actually get to the full meaning of the organism by working in a mechanical way from the bottom up. So those would be two areas that, if they're of interest to you, whether you agree or not, I don't know, but I'd be happy to talk about those.
Great. Yeah, that sounds excellent. Richard, any specific topics for you?
Many. I really enjoyed reading your chapters, Iain. Lots of that material really resonated with me very strongly. But, for a while, I found my linear mind getting frustrated that you wouldn't tell me in the right order what things that I needed to know, of course. And then I realized that, of course, you were giving the example of spiraling around the topic, which was just what you
exactly.
So then I felt a little bit more at ease, and that was okay. But I would like to talk about top-down and bottom-up understanding. So that resonates with what you just said about top-down and bottom-up understanding of living things. I would like to dig in a little bit on the metaphor of music. And as you say, metaphor is the stuff of thought. So, I really think that there's something there that crosses new gaps that would be worth discussing. And relatedly, there's stuff about folding away detail to get at the general shape of things. That when you look at the detail of things, you can't see the general shape. You can't see the infinity for all of the steps involved. So those are the sorts of things which are on my mind. But the leap between machines and living things is, captures a lot of that.
Would you like to say, Mike?
Yeah, no, perfect. Let's do all of that. Some of my stuff will come up while we're doing this, and other things, so that, I can keep till next time. It's fine. These are great. So yeah, I mean, maybe we can start with some of the lateralization stuff, and specifically, I guess one place we can start is for you, Iain, but to maybe talk about to what extent do you think the architecture is specifically bilaterally symmetric? In other words, that you need to have exactly two things that are tied in a particular way, or is more of the magic in the specific breakdown of the roles, and how what the different functions of each one is? Because I'm very interested in something. I worked for left-right asymmetry for a long time, but I'm interested in alternative architectures, right? So could we have, are there cognitive systems, either synthetic that we can make, or alien, or whatever, that could be in a completely different architecture? We are in a position to make animals with as many hemispheres as you want, really, right? So we can make 3, 4, you can make these things. And so the question is, so I'm interested in how, what is the essential, what do you think is the essential bit here? And with Richard, we had also talked about, at one point, we talked about a couple of things. He can talk about this, the importance of the sort of ebb and flow of these kinds of systems. And also, Richard, at one point, this was weeks ago, you had a really interesting comment about the computational power of having a second copy, so that you could, right? So what happens when you have sort of room to offload some things in the meantime? So anyway, so yeah, please, go for it. I think that's a good topic.
Well, you may or may not know that it's a theme that becomes more prominent in the matter with things, and particularly towards the second part, or I should say the second volume, that we need things and their opposites or contraries, and we need them both to maintain their integrity as distinct from one another, and yet also to be capable of a sort of union. So we need the principles of division and union together, so that when I think about the two hemispheres, there's evidence that they sometimes work together in a sense that we would normally call collaborating. They're working together in the same way towards certain ends, but they're often complementing one another by taking different approaches, and that this is important, and that we mustn't sort of either collapse them into being versions of the same thing, or say that they are so distinct that they don't work cooperatively, which they clearly do.
I mean, that also sounds like some of the stuff that Richard has been talking about, as far as alternating cycles of being soft in terms of letting the world imprint on you for a while, and then coming back to push, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's why I brought that up, because I thought that might be related to what Richard was saying.
Yeah, I think that the union and division, right? It's if the brain were not in halves, then you wouldn't be able to have any differences between the two parts, right? It's important that you have differences, because the differences between them create a whole that's worth having, right? If the two parts were the same as each other, then you just have double what you had before. It's important that they're different, because by being different, they create a whole that's more than the sum of the parts through the relation between them.
Yeah.
I take your question, Mike, that did it have to be 2? What if you divided it into 3 parts? And I am bothered by that. because it feels like maybe you could do things dividing into 3s and not 2s. Dividing into 2s is the obvious way to do things. It's like if you can't do something with one, then make a copy of it, differentiate them, and now you can do something more than you could do with the one of them. But there's something about I don't know, this is either going to sound mad or it's going to resonate with you. There's something about the period doubling in the logistic map that eventually exits chaos in a third. That makes me think that basically that thirds are real. And it doesn't have to always be period doubling.
Yeah. I mean, it's natural to think of 2s and so on, but actually, if you think about early embryonic development, where that never mind the asymmetry of just the drawing a midline, that is really not well understood at all. There's a lot understood of what happens after you've got sort of a left and right half. But that first, especially in amniotes, how it is that you divide, you got the thousands and tens of thousands of cells, and then how you decide where that midline is completely non-trivial. And we can interfere in that process and make other types of, and of course there are animals with other types of symmetries, but bilateral symmetry shows up very early on. Chirality is there even before that. But it's not super obvious how you bisect something that has lots and lots of little tiny.
Organisms with symmetries that are odd, like starfish. Is there a nice three-way symmetry?
So if I recall correctly, the starfish are actually not fivefold really. They're sort of bilateral with a like a Vitruvian man type of thing. And but there are jellyfish. The jellyfish do have true multiple and symmetries, and there are all kinds.
And then they're not always they're not always powers of two. They can
no.
Yeah. That's interesting that a lot of my creatures that I showed you the video the other day, Michael, a lot of them look like jellyfish, right?
Yeah.
Although,
Well, a couple of reflections I'd just make. One is that this lateral asymmetry is present in the earliest neural network of which we have any knowledge, 700 million years ago. It has this axial asymmetry. And there's a very good reason, I believe, why that should be the case, because of this business of the organism needing to pay finely narrowly focused, targeted attention to a detail that it already requires, and its ability simultaneously to keep the precisely opposite kind of attention open, the broad, vigilant attention without preconception as to what it might find or what it's interested in. So that makes a natural, as it were, pairing, and out of that pairing, almost anything can come. After all, through the pairings of 1 and 0, many complex structures can be made. As soon as you've got 2, you've already got potentially many things, because, as I often say, you need both. You need both and either or. So you need the situation where it's either or. That is an important distinction in life, but it's also important to have that as well as the both and ability to synthesize these things. Now, as soon as you've got that, you've already got more than 2 things. You've got either and or, and you've got the combination of the 2 and the relationship between all 3 of them, and so the thing expands from there. So although it may begin for very good evolutionary reasons as a pair, more than that, almost infinitely more of that can emerge from it.
So one could explain brain bilateral symmetry by the fact that it's growing in an organism that already has bilateral symmetry, if we're not. But if we take the organism itself to be fundamentally cognitive, even before it had a brain, in a basal cognition sort of way, then, that's just saying, bilateralism was always about cognition, and bilateral hemispheres in brains was just a particular extension of that. And if you go right back to the origin of multicellularity, it's like, well, was that likely to have occurred through cell divisions which didn't separate, in which case 2 would have been a natural number? Then the vibration that you can get between 2 cells that's different from the vibration that you can get in either one cell, because you can coordinate it. Right now you can have them, you can have one doing they could just be, I'll be on when you're off, right? We're the same period, but out of phase. I don't think there's any point in them being the same period and in phase. If they're the same period and out of phase, then that's, I'll be on when you're off, you'll be off when I'm on. But there's also the possibility that one is doing something at twice the frequency of the other, which is stable. But but now they're doing something intrinsically different. And it seems like it would be natural to create things which were powers of two that way, that will do two doublings instead of one doubling. But it's also, when you do the fact that the Taylor expansion gives you a third by 1 minus a half plus a quarter minus an eighth minus a 16th gives you a third, and that the pattern that you have to do that is just an oscillating pattern to do that. I think there's actually something really, I think it is very natural, Mike, that it's pairs to start with. I think that's there's good reasons for that. But I also think that there's something very interesting in considering other factors. Other multiples.
But a couple of other things occur to me on that. One is, you mentioned that chirality goes well before life, and it does. And of course, famously, there is the weak force is chiral in its nature, and chirality has a left-handed spiral and a right-handed spiral. I'm not sure what the spiral would be that was the third-handed spiral. Would mean that's where all this, in a way, starts. And the other thing is that in the metaphysics part of the matter with things, I spend a lot of time on the importance of the coincidence of opposites. And much of everything that we see seems to be structured on what we call opposites, because we think in this sense of them being at opposite ends of something, but they may just be the complements of one another, that you cannot have one without the other. This is a very, very ancient insight. It's present probably in all the sophisticated cultures that we know of. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's... And it was, in the 19th century, it was Pasteur who said life needs asymmetry. Symmetry it may have in places, but that's completely unimportant. It's asymmetry that allows life to flourish, and it does so, he thought, because it reflected the innate asymmetry of the cosmos. And Pierre Curie, commenting 20, 30 years later, said that the asymmetry of the cosmos, not so much of life, but of the cosmos, was absolutely central to its existence and persistence. So I think this idea of asymmetry is good. And asymmetry and symmetry are a pairing that mop up what else. I mean, what would be your third thing in there? I mean, the third thing is chaos, actually. It's simply chaos. Not everything that is not symmetrical is, strictly speaking, asymmetrical. It may just be a mess.
One interesting thing about in the establishment of symmetry in the early embryo, it's very easy. There are many treatments that we've discovered that confuse the left and the right halves about which one they are. So you can get double left, double rights. You can get mirror image. That's very easy. But of all of those treatments, in every single case, except for one, which we finally at the end discovered, but it took a long time. Everything else, all it does is it confuses which side thinks it's left and which side it's right. But all of the individual cells within that side agree. So if you use a marker that shows you whether something's left and right, you never see speckled. You never see every cell confused and its neighbor has a different option. You don't see that. You just see, this way, this way, this way, or this way. But there is exactly one thing that we found that breaks the concordance, right? So normally you can
randomize
it and you can make the left and right halves flip a coin as to which they are, but all of the cells within each half flip the same coin, with one exception. There's only one thing that breaks that. And the thing that breaks it is a cellular alignment mechanism, literally alignment, but also metaphorically, I think, alignment in the cognitive sense. But it's a planar polarity mechanism that allows the cells to be literally aligned in the same direction, not even in left right. It's actually an alignment in anterior posterior. But once you break that, then you get the speckling, and then you get individual cells that don't know what to do, as opposed to whole coherent, cohesive regions that don't know what to do. So, you know, I really like that whole model as this like way of thinking about what does it take to make selves, to make a coherent individual out of pieces that makes a collective decision, right? This sort of collective decision making.
What significance would you attribute to this final case that you described with the anterior-posterior alignment, but not left-right coherence?
I think
if
that
I've understood you right.
Yeah. I think the reason that I found it interesting is because what it gets to is this question of collective decision making. So what is a collective intelligence, right? And so which we all are in a sense. And so what the question we have to answer is, in what sense does the collective have goals, memories, whatever else that the individual pieces don't have? How do these, right? So we are a bunch of cells, fine, but then we have all kinds of sort of cognitive and morphological properties that the individual parts don't have. And so that right at the beginning of embryogenesis, when 50,000 cells have to come together to give one embryo, one individual, eventually one, let's say in the case of humans, one human. This is a breakdown of that collective decision-making process. And we have many other examples where they all of the components begin to make decisions as one. They're all synchronized. And some of that is bioelectrical, some of it is these planar polarity alignment mechanisms. But to me, this is the root of the whole business. When you start with 50,000 cells and you look at it and you say, this is one embryo, right? Like, what are you counting when you say it's one embryo? You're in a functional sense, and it doesn't have to be one, because I can't recall if we have already talked about this, but if you make little scratches in it what you'll get is multiple conjoined twins, because until that scratch heals, each portion doesn't know that there's other portions around, and it basically decides, I'm going to be the embryo. And then of course they all do that, and then eventually they heal, so you can have twins and triplets and whatnot. And so this issue of how many individuals, how many humans are in any one embryo is not fixed by the genetics. It's not fixed by the physics. It's a kind of an outcome in software, so to speak, because it could be 0, 1, 2, 3, 5. It could be, some number.
It's a really perfect example of the top down and the bottom up involved there, right? That, if you think of where is the embryo and how many embryos there are as a question that you can answer bottom up, then it's, well, these are the parts, so that must make one embryo. But the fact that the whole becomes divided into two parts, that's a macro scale phenomenon. That top down organizes the parts to orchestrate them to make a whole.
Yeah. And then of course we have cases, right, that are sort of partial, right? So sometimes they're separate and you can make twins that are completely separate, but you can also make ones like this that overlap. And there are even well, you can make them in any orientation, but there are human cases, of course, too, right? Where you've got two bodies and kind of the brain is fused, or vice versa. There are all sorts of possibilities.
Did I ask you already whether conjoined twins ever join up parts which are not homologous?
Yes, you can.
What was the answer?
You can. There are that can happen. Yeah, that can happen.
But presumably the conjoining is much more superficial in that case, right? That it just, so if I make a conjoined twin, the joint between the head and the foot, then it's only actually integrated at the skin or something.
No, it goes pretty deep. So there are, it can, you can have this kind of scenario where out of the middle of one embryo starts basically sprouting another one, and at the connection, it's nuts. They're connected all the way through. Yeah, you can make almost anything artificial, and then of course these things occur naturally too. But we can make, especially in something like a chicken, where it's very easy to kind of manipulate all the parts. You can make almost anything.
So I don't know if this is a little bit too nitty gritty, but whilst you were talking about that, I was thinking about Iain's suggestion of opposites and chaos. And I've still got the logistic map in mind. Do you mind if I share my screen to point out something in the logistic map that I showed?
Go for
Mike before, but I didn't show Iain. So in the logistic map here, you have this first doubling and then another doubling and then another doubling, and then pretty soon it turns into chaos. And it's like, are we up or are we down? And so on this path, we're up, and on this path, we're up. And on this path, we're up, and on this path, we're up, down, right? Whereas this one is down, up, and this one is down, down. So this line going up here, all the way up here is the up line. And this one going down here is the down line. How come this period doubling ever ends up at this period 3, right? Because there is no power of 2 that ends up in dividing into thirds, right? This resonance, which happens much later on. But as you can see, there's a little sort of trail of dust, a little bit of higher density stuff happening here that corresponds with the point of the third. What's that trail of dust there? Well, that's the I go down, I go up, 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 go down, I go up, down, I go up. So plus a half minus a quarter, plus an eighth minus a 16th, plus a 32nd minus a 64th. Look at that. It's a third, right? It gives you the period of the third. Another way of thinking about this, reflecting upon what Iain just said about, well, there's a thing and its opposite, is that in addition to 1 and minus 1, there is also 0. 0 is the unstable thing that you get with a perfect blend of this much minus 1 and this much 1, this much minus a half and this much half, this much minus a quarter and that much eighth. And that comes out at 0, which enables you to have 3 things instead of 2 things. Instead of the everything up position and the everything down position, there's the exactly cancelled out position in the middle. That's the only way to get thirds out of period doubling.
And why does the top part of the graph not produce the mirror image thirding that goes on in the bottom half of the graph?
Well, well, that's a good question. So there's a thirding happening here, which lines up with the 5th. Is that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Yeah. Oh, sorry, I'm pointing with my finger instead of the mouse pointer. Lines up with there, right? It gives you the other resonant frequency here. And here we have one that this one is cancelling out to give you half of a fourth. And this one is cancelling out to give you another half of a fourth. And together they give you a period 4. So there's the cancelling out on the top one, which comes first because it's more squashed. And the cancelling out on the bottom one, which comes second because it's less squashed. And when you have one without the other, you have thirds. And you know, if you take a naive view where you insist on opposites, you say, well, is it A or is it not A? And you say, well, that's you get into this region where you say it's neither, it's just a mess, it's just chaos. But there's a null, which is, you know, first of all, you might identify that as, well, it's neither A or not A, it's null, right? But then there's a more precise version of null, which is the perfect balance of being there and being not there, gives you exactly 0, which then takes its place as another genuine state. Now there's 1 and minus 1 and 0, 3 things and not just 2. I think it's a lovely example of those paradoxes you were talking about at the end of the chapter, Iain, where you're talking about, well, you know, I take this infinite number of steps, but I never see the infinity. I take this infinite number of steps, but I never catch up with the tortoise, right? So I take this infinite number of steps in the period doubling, but I never really see the third, right? But our eyes see the third for sure, right? Or we don't see that as some overlapping powers of 2 all smushed together. The resonance pops out as oh no, that's a real thing.
I wonder if the question of 0, which of course, as you know, the Greeks didn't have, but was introduced in probably the 6th, 7th century from India. um, is not so much a third entity, so to speak, as what happens when you allow opposites to do exactly what I was suggesting we shouldn't do, which is to collapse. I mean, for certain mathematical reasoning, we want them to do that. But what I'm suggesting is that in the physical world, the things being asymmetrical ultimately can, I mean, they may for certain purposes within very confined systems appear to cancel out, but ultimately they don't. I don't know if that's something you would agree with, Richard, or not.
But the cancelling out, you say at the gross scale, it looks like, oh, they disappeared. I've got nothing now. But there's another sense in which, wow, look at all of those, look at all of that spiraling depth that there is in order to create something, right? It's like, oh, it's gone this way. Oh, it's gone that way. Oh, it's gone this way. And you know that takes lots and lots of depth to actually to cancel them out. To then stay at the top level. Oh, it's almost like it went poof in a puff of smoke, and I didn't have anything at all.
Yeah.
Shall we talk about the machine business?
Sure. Yeah. And do either of you know the work of Robert Rosen? Yeah,
A little.
who I think is very interesting, and he's probably written about this more clearly than anyone, that that a living system has, as it were, final causes rather than just efficient causes. In fact, a living system is not the result of a single efficient cause, whereas a closed system such as a machine, well, it's open in the sense that it is open to an efficient cause, but it all can be accounted for by that efficient cause within that protected space of the machine. Whereas in a living being, even if you were to be able to start from a known standpoint, you'd soon run into problems of complexity where re-entrant loops occur, where decisions that cannot be predicted are made within the system and so forth. So this seems to suggest that, I mean, I'm cutting everything very fine here because I talk quite a bit about this, particularly in, I suppose, chapter 12. But my view is that there are, well, and of course in chapter 27, where I argue that it is almost impossible to talk intelligently about life without talking about the possibility of purpose, teleology, which, you know, Darwin was extremely keen on. Darwin said, thank goodness. And Darwin's bulldog, Huxley, also said, the great thing that Darwin has done is restored teleology. Which, as you know, J.B.S. Haldane said was like the scientist's mistress couldn't live without her, but wasn't willing to be seen with her in public. And I think this whole thing of teleology is so important. I mean, whenever you talk to scientists one-to-one and off the record, they say, well, of course, there are purposes and purposeful behavior, direct. All of what we watch is directional. And yet they're forced, as it were, by almost like belonging to the Soviet state, and there are rules, things you can say and things you can't say, just to deny this existence. So, I mean, that's a good provocative place to begin thinking about the differences between these systems. And I outline in chapter 12, which is called The Science of Life, a Study in Left Hemisphere Capture, because I believe that while physics gave up on this rather simple mechanical model a very long time ago, at least 100 years ago, biology has until very recently clung to this purely mechanical model. And I may be wrong, Michael, but I see you as one of the people who has been able to say, yes, look, there's more to it than this.
Yeah. So I think we could and probably should at some point talk about the teleology in machines and cybernetics and all that. But I 100% agree. I think teleology is absolutely key to all of this. One reason I don't like a sharp distinction, and I like Robert's work a lot. What I don't like about that sharp distinction between living things and machines is that we know now that, as we really didn't when Robert was writing this stuff, that we can make all the transition forms. So right, and so then we end up in this weird place where we have to try to come up with criteria for, so I can, we can now make something that's basically at every level, right? So you've got molecular, cellular, tissue, organ, swarm, you got all these levels. At every single level, we can introduce any percentage you want, from 0 to fairly high numbers, of something that you would call a machine, right? Something that was designed by humans, that may be quite complex, maybe has unpredictable behavior. I mean, it's easy to make machines with very difficult to predict behaviors, but nevertheless, they're designed, they're completely different from the natural in many ways.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I don't know what we do after that, because now we have something, if you have, we are already, there are humans that are, not 95% human, but there's some electronics there by which they run a wheelchair, or some prosthetic limbs, or some other stuff. And then we also have these Roomba vacuum cleaners, and pretty soon they'll have some human neural cells living on board to help them do various things. And then sort of every, but and those are easy to deal with, right? Because in this case, you say, you're just you're just a human with some peripherals, and you're just a vacuum cleaner with some human brain cells, fine. But we can make, right, any, and we're going to be seeing them, cyborgs, hybrids, we're going to be seeing all this stuff. And then I think we get into a really difficult place, where if we try to draw these hard boundaries. And
well, interestingly, sorry, go on.
No, please
finish.
Well, that's
okay.
That's just it. You
No, yeah. I mean, of course, there's an enormous amount one could say about all of that, but that would be another day, perhaps. But I just wanted to make clear that I actually surprisingly don't think there is a hard and fast difference between the living and the non-living. And in fact, Robert Rosen said as much. He said that animacy is the norm, and inanimacy is an asymptotic, never achieved state, in which animacy is reduced to a minimum. But the whole cosmos is animate. And I hold this to be the case. So what actually distinguishes them, some people would say, well, clearly inanimate matter doesn't have consciousness, but we think that living things do have consciousness, and now we think that very primitive living things probably have consciousness, so it's gone a long way down, if not to the very bottom of life. But in an earlier chapter, 25, I think, I argue that consciousness is an ontological primitive in the cosmos, and that in fact matter is a state, a phase of consciousness in which it exhibits greater stickiness, permanence, resistance than consciousness which has no matter in its form. So things persist longer and cause the possibility of resistance. And I believe that, in fact, nothing creative can happen without an element of resistance. So this thing that matter offers is incredibly important. So my view is that what we are used to calling inanimate matter does do many of the things very, very, very slowly, and very, very, very little that living things do. And what living things bring is not consciousness, because that's already there, but an increase in the capacity to respond and the speed of response. So living things respond to circumstances, to whatever it is that's around them, perhaps a billionfold faster than inanimate matter could possibly do, and respond to a vast range of elements that are there in the cosmos. So responding all the time to things much faster and on a much bigger canvas than the inanimate. So I see the difference as a matter of degree, if you like, but not that this means that there are long phases where you can't tell, but that nonetheless, even though animacy and inanimacy do seem very distinct, they do share important qualities, and the difference is more one of degree than of not.
Yeah, yeah.
I would like to offer a refinement on that. It's so nice to be able to have a conversation like that, and for somebody to be able to say things like that, and for us to be nodding along, I think, and it's just like, yep, I'm on board. Yeah.
Yes, it is nice and often unusual in science. But
yeah. So we could try and pinpoint the the continuous difference between living and non-living in terms of the scale of the physical scale of the capacity to respond, the temporal scale of the capacity to respond, the richness of the capacity to respond, things like that. I think I think there are reasons to suggest that there are some inanimate mechanisms that happen at very large scales and very quickly. Supernova explosion is a very big response and it happens very quickly, but it's still not living. And there are other things that happen slowly, and I'm not sure that the fast or slow and the big or small, I don't think you said big or small, actually, I said that. Fast or slow, I'm not sure that that's the right, I'm not sure that going one way makes things more living and going the other thing makes things more inanimate. I think it's more about the connection between the scales. Is the large scale connected to what's going on at the small scale? Is the fast scale connected to what's going on at the slow scale? When those things are connected, they behave organically, they behave animately. And when those things are not connected, then they behave like hardballs in space. Whether they're big or small or fast or slow, they just behave like hardballs in space.
may I respond to that, Mike? I like that very much. And perhaps I could clarify that what I meant was not that inanimate things can never do something fast, like a volcano exploding, but that generally speaking, without a cataclysmic force, there is no. There is this the fastness of response. I'm talking about a response to the whole set of circumstances. So, for example, there's a lump of rock in my garden, and I don't know what it is responding to, but whatever it's responding to, perhaps wind, water, and so on, it's responding to extremely slowly. But there is also a vole in the flower bed that is responding to everything a billion times faster at least, in a way that inanimate stuff just doesn't seem to do this. Complex reactions to many facets, many different kinds of values, if you like, of affordances, to use that kind of language. There are many affordances for living creatures, and they use them very rapidly, whereas lumps of matter tend not to. That's one thing I just wanted to say. So the other is, I don't know whether, I think it's true, this thing about the bridging of the scales, but I was very interested in an observation made by Mike Abramovitz that there are different, what he calls structures. He calls the distinction he's making between architective structures and connective structures. And what he means by architective structures are things that are relatively rigid and static, and when they change, when they make a change, they make a complete change, and it's as it were, it is a cataclysm. And there are things that are connected that change by means of flowing change, and that they are more. I mean, I don't know which bits of my book you've had a chance to catch up with, and I'm extraordinarily grateful that you've been able to. I can't remember what I sent, but
chapters 14 and 15, and another section on induction and deduction.
Oh, okay, yes, that was because of what you said about that. But yes, but anyway, I think this issue of the difference between concatenation and flow is absolutely essential. And these types of motion where things flow from one state into another these architective states which hold themselves until there's a break, and that they're rather like what Taleb calls fragile states. And the connective ones are anti-fragile. They make adaptations all the time so that they don't have that cataclysmic need to change. And the reason I'm mentioning all this is that he suggests that at the very lowest level, and particularly at the very highest level of magnitude, you only find connective states, and that the architective states are found more at the intermediate phase, where we happen to be leading our lives and have our experience. I've probably given a very bad account of that, but it's I do a better job in the book.
Thank you. Whose terms were those? Architective and connective?
They're a now retired physicist called Mike Abramovitz, but he has a very interesting web, and we've corresponded, and so there we are.
That makes a lot of sense to me. So there's a sense in which the rock in your garden can respond to things quickly. Like if you kick it, it moves, and from one part of, moves a little bit. You hit it with a hammer and it moves a little bit. It moves a little bit across the garden, and in a sense, that's a response to the force that's acted on it. But there's, but then the architective structure, if I can use that term already, isn't changed, right? It's still the same rock. It's just over here instead of over there. It didn't change its relationship to anything in so doing it, and it didn't change its internal organizational connective structure in response to that being hit with a hammer, right? But there are like the minimal example of a physical system that I've been thinking about recently that has some connection between scales is resonance in systems that resonate. So like in a tuning fork or a piece of steel, when you hit that, it doesn't just move, it doesn't just transfer the impulse and say, well, okay, I'll be over here. But when you hit it and it rings, there is a really intimate connection between the macro scale geometry of the fork as a whole and the micro scale elasticity of the molecules of steel holding it together. And one needs to be an integer multiple of the other in order for you to get a resonant standing wave in that geometry. And there's an intimate connection between the whole organizing the parts and the parts organizing the whole. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we say that the ringing of a bell feels organic or has lifelike structure to it when we. I think
that's because of its resonance, and I think this idea of resonance, reverberative connectivity, is essential to the understanding of well, just about everything, but certainly living things. What I think I may have misled you by saying is, what he's referring to is that there are certain kinds of things which are like chemical trophic for the constituents. They lose their qualities completely and become something else. So an evil-smelling greenish yellow gas mixes with some dull metal and it becomes table salt. And as it were, they've lost what they had before. This is architective change, he says. But there are other things that mix with one another, add themselves to things, and work by accretive processes where their existence is not a zero-sum thing. They have to go and something else comes. They are able to cause something to create a bigger entity out of the smaller elements that have come together. And I think that's all really that one needs to take on board for that point. I don't want to labor it, but it just seems to me quite interesting that he spots that catastrophic scale is above the scale of particles in physics, but is below the scale of the cosmos. And in the cosmos and in the very subatomic regions, what you see is not cataclysms in which one thing is wiped out and changes its nature completely, but that things come together and and create, as they do in the wider cosmos, to create something new, but it's not catastrophic for the constituent parts.
Yeah, I get it. It's and so the music metaphor for me is like when you put two notes together and they're concordant. Both the notes are still there, and they created something new. They created the interval.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But when you put two notes together which are discordant, then they just crash, and it seems to tear apart the two notes that you had.
Yes, that's a good metaphor. But what an extraordinary thing it is that by putting two completely meaningless, bland things together, a note and another note, you suddenly create an event and an experience. And the more you add, you can do things that are completely unpredictable from the outside. You can only know them when you hear them.
Yes. You can't tell. So if I give you 469 hertz and 468.9 hertz, you cannot tell the difference between those played separately, right? But when I play them together, you can hear the beat. You can hear the beating as they go in and out of phase.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There was something I'd like to return to the possibility of the hybrids and cyborgs that Mike was talking about, and what we were just talking about whether there's multiple scales involved in the dynamics or the system or the algorithm that's running. So in computer science, we have this notion of an algorithm being substrate independent, that you can implement the same algorithm in multiple different substrates, and it just doesn't matter because the details of the substrate that you implemented it on just don't matter to the essentially symbolic and discrete computation that you're doing at the higher level, right?
In other words, it's all syntax and no semantics.
Right. So by divorcing it of all of the concrete details of the instances, you get something that you can apply to other instances. You get the generalization, right? You get it's the same algorithm. But you lose that connection to the concrete instances in a way that the symbols that you're manipulating don't have any meaning, right? If you treat them abstractly, then they are, as you said, pulled out of their context in which they had some meaning. Now, so that notion of the substrate independence of algorithms suggests that you could replace part of an organism with a machine, or part of a machine with an organism, and it wouldn't really matter, or you would create something that was in between. But I'm not so sure about that. I think that when we implement an algorithm on a machine in a conventional sense, we are doing so in a way which is as divorced as possible from the physical implementation of it, so that it doesn't matter what numbers I put into my sorting algorithm, it never makes my logic gates overheat, right? That getting to the physics of what I implemented it on just doesn't matter. Like whatever computation I do on it just doesn't interact with the physical implementation. But in organisms, it's not just that it does interact with the physical implementation, but that they are organisms because it interacts with the implementation. So when you can get an organism to behave like an AND gate if you put it in the right circumstances, but when you make it do it over and over again, it says fuck this, and it crawls out of the dish and does something else, right? The interaction with the substrate of which it is made matters. And it matters not just because it's an unreliable algorithm, then it wasn't perfectly abstracted. That wasn't really a good way of implementing an AND gate then. That was the thing that made it organic, was that when you stress one level of function, the the implementational level of function below it begins to show. It begins to show through. And that's really important for me, for being able to get those responses that you were talking about, a quick response. It's by reorganizing the function. It's like, okay, well, I won't do that function, then I'll do this function, right? And a lot of the higher level and lower level integrity, the higher level and lower level structure is still there, but it's been reorganized. Whereas when you do that with a mechanical device and you push it beyond its limits, well, first of all, when you push it beyond its limits, it doesn't show you the in-between states. And you need the in-between states because it can't really be adaptive. It can't really learn unless its insides show. And when its insides do show, you just say, ah, shit, I broke it, right? Because it doesn't degrade gracefully, because you went straight from this really, really high level symbolic stuff to the physics it was made out of, multiple levels below. And that means that when the insides do show, it just breaks. It doesn't degrade gracefully.
I think.
Yes, I don't know enough about the systems that you're working with, really, but how they could be adapted to the way a plant takes in 15 kinds of measures and synthesizes them and, as it were, makes a decision about whether or not it's time to bud or flower or whatever it may be. I'm sure you could find algorithms that could make an artificial flower do something like this, but I don't know that it would be anything at all like the flower. I don't know.
Yeah, it's like,
unfortunately, I'm not a cyberneticist, so yeah.
How the flower behaves under normal circumstances could probably be extracted into such an algorithm involving 15 variables and a bit of logic. But what's really interesting about the flower is what it does when you put it under circumstances that are not quite like that, right? When Mike does an experiment and says, cuts it in half when it was only half when it was just a seedling. How many plants do you get, right? And that's now it's making two decisions. This one is deciding differently from that one. How did it make two? How can one thing make two decisions, right? It's like, because
that's right. And also, again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this situation sounds different from the execution of an algorithm, where, and I described this in one of the chapters, but effectively, Monica Galliano has done experiments with pea shoots where they're deprived of light, and the light comes on in a Y-shaped structure that is over the bed in which they are, and it comes on in one or other arm of the Y entirely at random. So you can't predict each time which it will be, but sometime before the light comes on, a puff of air is sent down the arm of the tube out of which the light is going to come. And these pea shoots that are starved of light benefit from orientating themselves towards where the light is coming from. And I believe that in only 3 days, they learn to orientate towards where the puffs of light are coming from, puffs of air are coming from, because that's where the light will come from. And intriguingly, the reverse case has also been done as a control, in which the puff of air comes down the arm from which the light will not come. And the pea plants, appropriately in the other, again, within a few days, learn. Now, that's not something they could conceivably have been, as it were, programmed by, either from their own experience or from any past historical experience. This seems like intelligent behavior.
Yeah, I don't have any problem with that. Mike's not surprised, right?
No, I'm not surprised. Yeah, and I think I think what we were just saying about you don't see what it can do until you stress it is 100%. I mean, this is why. This is one reason why teleology. Well, it's not the biggest reason, but one reason why people aren't into it is because what they observe most of the time is the default behavior, let's say, of embryos, and they think it's a purely feed-forward emergent system. They say, oh, complexity and emergence, right? So local rules, we know local rules can give rise to complexity, and look, it does this thing. Well, there you go. So, and they said, well, you can't just label that as intelligence. It's like it's just that's what it has to do. And that's true if all you do is observe the standard default behavior. But once you start putting barriers in its way and you start stressing it in various ways, then you get pulled out of this false sense of inevitability, and you see that, oh, it actually has what some degree, depending on what you're looking at, of what James called intelligence, which is the ability to reach the same goal by different means. And you start to see the incredible ingenuity that these things can muster in different problem spaces. Okay, I apologize. I have to run. Can we schedule a new one by email? Is that cool?
Yeah, that'd be great. Yes, yeah.
Fantastic.
Good,
guys.
I'm going to be traveling between about April the 25th and May the 15th, but up until April, especially up until April the 16th, I'm pretty good.
Excellent. Okay, got it. Perfect. Okay, I'll schedule. Thank you so much. Great to see you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, both of you.
Thank you.